In this lesson, we are going to learn about deductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning is a form of logical thinking that uses facts to draw conclusions. And in this lesson, there are two main laws of logic we are going to learn about, and these laws of logic can be used to determine the validity of statements. For each of these laws, we are going to use this symbol. It looks like 3 dots that almost form a triangle to represent the word therefore. Okay, the first law of logic we're going to look at is called the law of detachment. So given a conditional that is true, if the hypothesis is true, then the conclusion is true. So let's look at that in symbolic form. If we have a conditional that's true, if P then Q, and we know the hypothesis is true, then the conclusion must be true. So there's our therefore symbol. So if P then Q is true, and P is true, therefore Q is true. Let's look at a sample problem with that. If we are given these facts and these statements, if you are a senior in high school, then you can apply to college. You are a senior in high school. So we know these two statements are true. So our conclusion, okay, so if you're a senior in high school, then you can apply to college. Well, we know that you are in fact a senior in high school. The conclusion is you can apply to college. So we know the hypothesis is true, therefore the conclusion of that initial conditional must also be true. All right, let's look at the other law of logic. That's called the law of syllogism. This law allows you to draw a conclusion from two conditionals where the conclusion of the first statement is also the hypothesis of the second statement. Here's what that looks like symbolically. If we know if P then Q is true, and we know if Q then R is true, therefore we know if P then R is going to be true. So notice here the conclusion of the first statement is also the hypothesis of the second statement. All right, we'll look at this as an example too. So it says, if it is Monday, then you must have school. If you have school, then you must get up early. So notice that the conclusion of the first statement, you have school, is also the hypothesis of the second statement, you have school. This is how you would detect the use of the law of syllogism. So to write a conclusion, we're going to kind of use the missing pieces that we did not already use. So our conclusion would be, if it is Monday, then you must get up early. It's kind of like we're using from those initial conditionals the pieces that did not overlap, the part that was not used twice. So we saw you have school twice already in our given facts. We're going to use the others to write a conclusion. Okay, let's take a look at some sample questions on deductive reasoning. Number 1, use the given statements and the law of detachment to draw a conclusion. So we have the conditional, if a number is divisible by 2, then it is even. And we also have the fact that 10 is divisible by 2. So notice how this second given statement is corresponding to that initial hypothesis of the conditional. So we can now conclude using the law of detachment that 10 is an even number. So since it is divisible by 2, we know that it is even. Okay, let's try another law of detachment question. Use the given statements and the law of detachment to draw a conclusion. If it is Pi Day, then it is March. Today is Pi Day. So again, notice how these correspond. So we can make a conclusion that since it's Pi Day, it is March. Now let's take a look at some with the law of syllogism. Number 3 says to use the law of syllogism to write a valid conclusion. Assume the statements below are true. If you go running, then you will burn calories. If you burn calories, then you will lose weight. Notice how the conclusion of the first conditional and the hypothesis of the second conditional are the same thing. So we're going to make a third conditional using these two remaining pieces. So we could write as our conclusion, if you go running, then you will lose weight. Okay, let's look at one more like that. Use the law of syllogism to write a valid conclusion. Assume the statements are true. If you work 5 hours, then you will earn $100. If you earn $100, then you can buy new sneakers. So again, notice how these two statements, those two pieces of the statements correspond. We're going to write a conclusion using the remaining pieces. So if you work 5 hours, then you can buy new sneakers. All right, and let's look at one last question here. Do the given statements and conclusion below follow the law of detachment, the law of syllogism, or neither? And we're going to assume the statements are true. All right, let's look at our first given. If you study, you will be prepared, then you will be prepared for the exam. Given, if you are prepared for the exam, then you will pass the exam. Conclusion, if you study, then you will pass the exam. Well, I notice the first two givens are both conditional statements. I also notice that the conclusion of the first given is the same as the hypothesis of the second given. So if I were to write a conclusion using the two remaining pieces, I would get, if you study, then you will pass the exam, and that is what we have as our conclusion. This is basically using what we saw in questions 3 and 4, which is the law of syllogism. Hopefully this lesson helped you learn a little bit more about these two laws of logic.